morning, everyone. On behalf of the ISO, we'd like to welcome you to today's Resource Adequacy Modeling and Program Design Track 2 Options for RAIM Reform meeting. This meeting will be an input session to inform the straw proposal. My name is Christina Guimera, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I will be facilitating today's meeting. I'm joined by Anya Gilbert, Ansel Lundberg, David Slotlow, and Abdul Muhammad Ali. Just a few reminders before we get started today. Today's call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. This meeting is intended to stimulate open dialogue and engage different perspectives. So please keep your comments professional and respectful today. And also, please try to keep your comments succinct so that we're able to hear from everyone. You can access closed captioning on the bottom left hand of your screen, and then Teller Transparency Viewer on the bottom right hand of your screen. Just be sure to refresh that before viewing. And we welcome and look forward to your participation today. For raising your hand during the meeting, please use the raise hand icon directly at the bottom of your WebEx screen. And if you joined audio only, please press *3 on your device. And please remember to state your name and affiliation first before making a comment. And please make sure to pause a few seconds before speaking after a meeting. Sometimes there's some WebEx delays and it can cut off your introduction. And you can also send comments and questions in via chat to all panelists. And if you need technical assistance during the meeting, please send a chat to the event producer in Teller Events. Today's objectives include socializing possible options for RAIM reform and outage definitions, as well as hearing feedback from stakeholders on what options they prefer to pursue in a straw proposal and why. Today, Anya is going to be taking us through the background, path, as well as possible options for RAIM reform design, as well as a discussion on MOO under UCAP. And then after that, we'll take a brief break before going into settlement and cost allocation for RAIM reform options. And after that, Anya will take us through outage definition changes before Ansel Lundberg will discuss next steps before we wrap up for the day. So with that, I will turn things over to Anya Gilbert, Manager of Policy Development, to get us started.
All right, good morning. And we can stay on this slide for a moment. As Christina mentioned, my name is Anya Gilbert. I'm the Manager of Policy Development for Demand Flexibility. As the former lead for Track 2 and RAIM reform, I'll be walking through some of the material that we've been developing. And as Christina mentioned, today's discussion is going to help inform the direction the CAISO takes for a future straw proposal, which will be led by my colleague, Ansel Lundberg, who many of you know from Track 1 of the RAMPD initiative on default rules. So to set some context, today, we're focusing on how CAISO ensures that resource adequacy capacity doesn't just get procured on paper, but is available operationally when the system needs it. As covered in the agenda, and just to recap, today we're going to cover 4 things: the tools that we use today to incent availability, options to reform or replace RAIM with some examples, a forward-looking discussion on how UCAP may change how we define and measure performance, including whether the must-offer obligation alone remains the right benchmark. And then lastly, and separately, we'll also discuss some new outage definition changes. And our goal here is really to put design options in front of you and get your directional feedback ahead of that straw proposal. So with that, let's go ahead and move 2 slides forward for our background. So resource adequacy is the forward commitment of physical capacity to ensure that CAISO can reliably serve load. It's a reliability obligation, not just a procurement exercise, and it really does provide the bridge between planning and operations. Local regulatory authorities' role is really to ensure procurement and planning, whereas CAISO's role is to ensure availability and operations. We also have resource adequacy to reduce reliance on emergency actions or out-of-market interventions. And in this RA track, our focus on whether committed RA capacity actually materializes when and where it's needed to support system reliability. Next slide. So my goal for this slide is really to outline the tools that we have today and will under EDAM to incent or indicate availability. It's not an exhaustive list, but rather an approach to hit on some of the themes that we'll be covering today. And so if we take a step back, on a year-ahead basis, UCAP is kind of a tool to help adjust a resource's NQC to reflect a historical forced outage rate, to align kind of the accreditation practices with reliability. What can we actually expect from this resource? And it also creates an incentive to keep forced outage rates low in order to be able to sell more RA from that resource. On a year ahead and month ahead basis for supply plans, the CAISO receives an indicator of what RA commitments are being made by LSCs and generators. And on a day ahead basis, we have two kind of tools, both an indicator and incentive with the EDAM resource sufficiency evaluation failure surcharge and our must offer obligation. So when EDAM goes live, in cases when BAA does not kind of pass the EDAM RSE, there is a penalty for when a BAA fails that sufficiency test. And this is really an incentive to discourage reliance on other balancing authority areas to cover its own obligations. Day ahead in real time, for some resources, there is a must offer obligation that requires RA resources that submit bids into the CAISO market for their capacity to be available for system needs and really for the CAISO to operationalize that RA capacity. As an indicator of reliability, we have RAIM today as an incentive mechanism to assess RA resources to be available. So with this background, and maybe a note I want to hit on is relevant for today's conversation, is that once EDAM goes live, we're really going to have two incentive tools that assess availability of resource commitments to ensure capacity is available when and where needed, in the form of the EDAM RSE failure surcharge and in the form of RAIM. Next slide. To spend a moment on our RA obligations and measurement, RA resources need to be physically capable, procured and shown, and be offered into the market based on their must-offer requirements. And CAISO operationalizes RA capacity through the must-offer obligation to ensure that RA is shown to the market, available at the right time, and dispatchable and reliable. And really, those RA megawatts only are providing reliability value if those RA megawatts are offered and available. And we have this in place since RA megawatts that don't show up could undermine our planning assumptions, increase operational risk, and shift reliability burden onto the system and other participants, and result in costly actions to maintain reliability. So with that, I can pause for questions. Otherwise, let's start moving into the next section that delves into possible options for RAIM reform design.
I'm not seeing any questions coming in at this time, so I think we can continue.
Sounds good. So I'll remind folks right now that our goal for today's session is to put out possible options for stakeholders to consider, and your input and comments on these options that we're putting forward is going to help develop a future straw proposal from ANSEL. So let's move to the next slide. And I wanted to start on a refresher on where we left off with RAIM reforms. In our former issue paper and stakeholder discussions last year, we had a construct referred to as measuring unavailable RA, or MURA, and that leaning that was shared with the working group would have determined availability by comparing bid performance to their must-offer requirements. But in contrast to RAIM today, rather than looking at the availability assessment hours, MURA would have assessed the resources during critical conditions, which we had put forward a leaning of being EEA 1 through 3, as well as EEA Watch. The approach would have penalized resources that didn't meet their must-offer obligations, and there was still discussion on how to think about caps on penalties, whether that should be per event and or per year for resources, and how to form the cost basis of that penalty, whether it was through a fixed tiered price or some sort of clawback mechanism. And kind of different from RAAIM, it would have taken the penalty from those resources that had not met their must-offer obligations, and that revenue collected from that penalty quantity would have been given back to load that had procured that resource adequacy capacity to begin with, but didn't see that RA materialize. In terms of the stakeholder feedback that we received on the MRA leaning, was that the measurement window may cover too few hours to drive meaningful behavior, that there was a perception that it could create a double penalty for resources under a UCAP framework, that it might not provide incremental incentives beyond existing energy market revenues and UCAP performance risk. And overall, there was some that felt that the proposal might not materially change availability outcomes. And so, with this feedback in mind, I'd like us to talk about what options we could consider through the lens of bookend approaches. And so with that, let's move to the next slide. So one kind of option for us to think about is more of a fork in the road. We could kind of think about reform to RAAIM as kind of incremental changes to the existing RAAIM construct. And at the other end of the spectrum, or the other fork in the road, we could explore the concept of using the EDAM resource sufficiency evaluation failure surcharge on the penalty side and payments from day ahead in real time on the incentive side. With both of these options, we're still maintaining the purpose of resource adequacy to have RA when and where needed. And really our key discussion is what the incentive level is and when it's measured. On the RAAIM reform side of the options, we could consider an approach that is a kind of modified form of RAAIM and MRA, where the hours are, for example, restricted maintenance operations hours, EEA watch once RERR has been triggered through EEA3. We could consider eliminating exemptions that exist today. For example, there is currently an exemption for resources that are under 1 megawatt. This kind of change to look at critical conditions does change the penalty structure, whereas RAAIM today has monthly netting. This would be a change to have a per event penalty or reward. We could explore kind of penalty options and as a placeholder use kind of the current RAAIM penalty incentive structure. In terms of when it's measured, the measurement is really when it's needed during critical conditions, which is based on the hours that I first described. At the other end of the reform option side, we could consider an approach that uses the EDAM RSC failure surcharge to replace RAAIM and compensate when the CAISO BAA is supporting other BAAs that fail the EDAM RSC. This is when it would be measured in instances when, as a part of the CAISO's BAA RSC, a failure occurs, and as a reminder, we have the RSC to formulate the CAISO's reliable day-ahead operating plan. In many ways, this second option has some features that look like RAAIM today, in that there is an incentive to be available, unavailability is penalized, and being available is rewarded. And you can also consider the fact that EDAM, once it goes live, does introduce a second availability-based financial signal through the RSC failure surcharge, which creates overlap with RAAIM and raises the question of whether two tools are necessary. So from here, I'd like to do a click down on both of the approaches. And for RAAIM reform, let's go to the next slide. So here for RAAIM reform, if we're looking at kind of the left side of that fork in the road of reforming our existing RAAIM, you know, our purpose here is still to incent that RA capacity to be available when and where needed. It's a tool to ensure the CAISO's balancing authority, resource adequacy fleet resources are available and meeting their must-offer obligations. And think of it as a simplified RAAIM structure, but measured or based on critical conditions. Similar to today, we could determine availability by comparing those bids offered to their must-offer requirements. And again, rather than the AAH that we use for today's RAAIM, it would be assessed during critical conditions. We would be penalizing resources that don't meet their must-offer obligations. And if this option moves forward, we need to collectively think about if there should be a penalty for cap event or for year, and how to think about how that penalty price is designed. And again, this approach is different than the MERA option that we put forward previously, in that here it looks more like RAAIM today, where the penalty collected from non-availability kind of enters into a pool and is allocated back to resources that demonstrate a reasonable level of availability. We are still considering eliminating exemptions. As we take a step back and think about kind of the benefits or challenges with the approach, some of the benefits are targeted incentives. We're really encouraging availability during the hours when the system needs it most, whereas today with RAAIM, with the monthly netting, a resource can fail to be available when there is grid stress and be paid for availability when it really wasn't available on a stressed grid day. In other ways, some of the benefits of this approach is it lowers the compliance burden. It is reducing complexity by avoiding assessments in hours with less grid stress. And some of the other benefits are continuity. We're keeping the existing RAAIM structure with some incremental improvements in place. Some of the challenges with this approach are related to incentive levers. And that really comes down to agreement on defining when it applies and the penalty cost applied. I think one of the other challenges here are uncertain outcomes. It isn't a given that some of these incremental changes will result in improved availability. I think some of the trade-offs that we can consider with this approach versus others is that it does allow for more quick and targeted improvements without overhauling kind of the current RA or RAAIM structure that we have today. Next slide. Great. Our second option for stakeholders to consider is replacing RAAIM with the EDAM RSD failure surcharge. And our purpose here hasn't changed. It's still to incent RA capacity to be available when and where needed, but we're looking at a new assessment period. And here that assessment period is those critical hours where capacity is required for the CAISO BAA to pass the EDAM RSD. And the cost changes as well, as the penalty payments based on the EDAM failure cost. And from a design perspective, when the CAISO BAA fails the EDAM RSD, costs are either allocated to the resources that didn't meet their must-offer and or meter demand. But it really depends on essentially the cost causation driver of what is causing that EDAM RSD failure. And so under this design concept, if when the RSD fails, if that RSD failure quantity is larger than the RA megawatts that didn't meet their must-offer obligation, we first allocate that penalty as a result of not being available to the RA up to the must-offer obligation shortfall, and the remainder is allocated to meter demand. However, if that RSD failure quantity is less than the RA megawatt must offer failure, all of the penalty goes to the RA megawatts that didn't meet their must offer obligation. There's also a payment slide, and some of our future examples don't fully flesh out the payment option, and we can do that later if this is kind of a leaning where stakeholders want to go. But there is a payment as well. So when the CAISO BAA in EDAM supplies energy to an EDAM BAA that fails their EDAM RSB, the CAISO BAA is paid a day-ahead in real-time payment, and we could explore using a similar structure how to allocate this between RA resources that met or exceeded their must-offer obligations and or metered demand. Some of the benefits of this approach are alignment with the EDAM and WEAM RSC design, and it really harmonizes the RA penalty and reward structure with the RSC. There's also kind of a simplification benefit here in that we have one penalty framework rather than two tools to assess day-ahead availability. Some of the challenges are the implementation complexity. And one of the trade-offs here is kind of bigger structural changes and kind of bigger structural changes that we're making, but we also have a cost allocation structure that's based on cost causation and RAIM reform. And let's go to the next slide. And this is where, this is maybe how to think about some of the feedback that you provide. In considering both of these approaches, our team has some questions for you all to consider, which we would love to either hear now, ahead of getting into the example, or you can offer in comments. And the first is thinking about, when should penalties apply? What are the conditions by which we would want to create this incentive? Is it really any time a resource that is counted as RA fails to offer or perform? Or is it really kind of only looking at it when the system is depending on that resource for reliability? The second consideration is, how strong should these penalties be? What level should those penalties be? We want it to be strong enough to deter non-performance, but we don't want it to be so strong that it discourages participation or drives excessive risk. A third consideration is how to align incentives and penalties. We want to ensure that resources are performing and rewarded, but we want to ensure that non-performance is economically irrational. For example, we wouldn't want to set up a situation where it is financially kind of more beneficial to take a RAIM penalty rather than to provide outage and substitution. And lastly, we have to think about the basis for the penalty and how to derive it. And there's some challenges with either option. From an administrative perspective, if we were to take an administrative penalty approach, the big challenge is it can be misaligned with actual costs. However, using trading prices might be more accurate, but it's difficult to obtain those numbers in a timely manner, which can result in also being misaligned with actual costs, just based on collecting that information. And then I did receive a question in chat that I want to address. There's a question on did not meet their must offer, asking a question if that wasn't an adequate offer or if they didn't deliver on awards. And our must offer is really tied to making that resource available up to its shown value and based on kind of our reliability requirements, BPM, which outlines kind of what is expected for different resource types. And it is really, to answer that question, it's really about offering those megawatts to the market. So just wanted to flag that. There is a kind of UIE for not delivering on awards, unobstructed imbalance energy charges for not delivering on awards that exists today. So with that, let me pause and see if there are any questions. I see we have 4 in the chat. Christina, would you mind? Stacy, would you mind unmuting folks?
Yeah, so first in the queue, we have Paul Nelson. Can we please unmute Paul?
CPUC Energy Division. Can people hear me okay?
Yes, thank you, Paul.
So going back to, I got a couple of questions. Going back to you kind of had the bookend approaches approach. So the RAIM reform, are you thinking about that would apply to other balancing authorities within EDAM or just with the CAISO balancing authority entities?
This entire discussion is only about the CAISO BAA and the incentives we have for the CAISO BAA's RA fleet.
Okay.
So if it is not related to any other BAA other than the CAISO BAA.
Okay. That's helpful. I just wanted to, I saw that in the slides, but I just wanted to confirm you're not thinking about applying RAIM to other balancing authorities. And so then use of option 2 of using the resource sufficiency evaluation, that's done at the balancing authority level, is my understanding. So,
that is right.
So if the CAISO balancing authority passes, but there are individual performance, individual resources that say are having subpar performance, there wouldn't be any incentive mechanisms or payments made between the resources then. Is that correct?
And Paul, if I'm hearing you correctly, you're kind of noting an instance where maybe the CAISO BAA passes the EDAM RSC, but some RA resources fail to perform. Is that correct?
Correct.
You are correct. So what we are outlining in option 2 is a scenario in which that performance is only measured in cases when a failure occurs. Okay. And so you are correct in that availability is not assessed anytime an RA resource bids, but only in those periods of non-availability and the CAISO BAA failing the EDAM RSC.
Okay. So under option 2, if the only time CAISO balancing authority would receive payments is when another balancing authority EDAM fails the RSC, and then
that is correct.
I don't know how those revenues get allocated. I mean, how I don't know under EDAM how those revenues under RSC get allocated. Do they go to load sort of entities, to resources? Are they split?
Today, my understanding is it goes to meter demand.
Meter demand.
It is correct.
And that would continue under option 2. Okay.
No. One clarification there. So actually, maybe it's a clarification. I'm moving the slides in the room, but are you all able to see the table that has RAIM replacement with EDAM RC failure surcharge?
Yes, I am. Yes.
Okay, great.
But you're showing on screen right now a different slide.
I guess, Stacy,
you want to.
Could you move up to slide 13, please?
Yeah, Anya,
yeah.
I control the slides for the stakeholders, so let me know which one to move to.
Thank you. Sure. If we can move to slide 13. So, Paul, I will clarify that today under EDAM, the cost allocation is to meter demand. And what this proposal is exploring is if we should kind of think about the penalty or payment based on RA resource performance. And so under the payment option, if a CAISO BAA is supplying energy to an EDAM BAA that fails the EDAM RSC, this proposal could consider how to allocate those payments to RA megawatts essentially that met or exceeded their must-offer obligation, and or if we would want to kind of have a cost allocation structure that divided that incentive to also include meter demand.
Okay. So yeah, definitely 2 different bookends, adequately described on the earlier page. Very, very different. options and what's going on. Okay. Thank you, Anya.
Thank you, Paul.
Next in the queue, we have Yongbin Wang. Go ahead. It looks like we lost him. And go ahead and join the queue again if you're still having a question. And in the meantime, we'll take a question from Carrie Bentley. Go ahead, Carrie.
Our trading forum. I have kind of a high-level question. You keep saying that RAAIM is supposed to incent capacity where and when needed, but I think of it more as where and when and how needed, because it was created in the construct of flexible RA and requiring economic bids. So this deck seems to presume that that kind of flexible RA check isn't needed anymore. And I'm wondering if when we think about this initiative, we should assume then the flexible RA product is going away, or whether we should consider that within these options.
No, thank you, Carrie. This is Partha Melbeck, or the CAISO. I probably wouldn't go quite that far to say that we're presuming that Flex RA is going away as a part of this. I think right now when we're discussing this as an option, we're really designing this around generic RA in terms of how this mechanism will work. But we recognize as well that part of what we committed to doing in the RA initiative was to reevaluate Flex RA, and that at the highest level, it was kind of like there's the question around, should we get rid of it, which was sort of one option? Should it be redesigned in a very large way, or were there sort of middle changes that need to be made to make it more effective under the current design? So we're still under that process of internally of looking through those options, and that ultimately I think that we need to have a incentive mechanism that worked well with Flex RA too. And I think it'd probably be maybe a similar principle of saying we would need to look at the requirements and program design for Flex RA to make sure that we're getting the attributes that we're paying for when the procurement's done. So that makes sense, Carrie?
I mean, what you're saying makes sense, but the timing doesn't make sense to me, because both of these options are not really compatible with ensuring economic offers day after day from Flex RA resources, which the CAISO has always maintained is a purpose of having the flexible RA RAAIM, which is 17 hours a day, every single day. It's much more broad than the system requirement. And your proposals here narrow the instances of observations so severely that I don't think they would do anything for Flex RA. So it's really hard to see how it's compatible. I would say, no, you can't do either of these if you guys still have the goal of ensuring economic offers from Flex RA. However, I'd say, sure, let's keep going down these paths if Flex RA is gone. So I do think you need to make a decision about Flex RA prior to redesigning RAAIM, because your answer and what's most efficient will be very different whether that product still exists. And then just a small observation on option one. Maybe you guys can present the data on this again, but it was my understanding that resources, and you provided this data before, resources were actually more available during the EEA instances than at other times. So to me, it seems a little weird that one of your options would be to try and incent more availability during periods that the market is already naturally ensuring resource availability. Your EEA events also coincide with your highest market prices. So already resources are very incented to be available during those periods. So just generally, I think my observation is more data is needed to evaluate these, and it's very hard for me to comment on them. Maybe the data has been updated since the last time we looked at it. And then I guess finally, maybe just a quick question, and are you asking stakeholders to choose between these options, only comment on these two options, or is kind of the the world of options still open to you guys?
Yeah, thanks, Carrie. Maybe I'll start with the last one and I'll try to work backwards. I think the world of options is still available. We're looking to move forward in still a collaborative, stakeholder-driven manner. We have what we describe as sort of two options that we're looking to, but we also, I think, recognize the fact that stakeholders might have a third or a fourth option that they want to present. And I think we're certainly still open to that. But maybe providing feedback on why these two are not quite right, and if you all have a third solution to say, hey, here's a more tailored or a different solution that you think better addresses the goals, that'd be helpful. In terms of your feedback on the EEA hours, we're happy to provide some more of that data. I think that some of our earlier rounds of analysis, it was a little bit of a mixed analysis where, at least what I believe that we showed was that there were certain resources when we looked at some of those really stressed days that were not available or that had less availability. And some of it was from ambient D rates. Some of it was from, other outage types. And we had kind of a breakdown in terms of what those look like. We've obviously had fairly few, fortunately, of these type of situations to look at what availability looks like, but some of this analysis was going back to, I believe, 2021, in particular 2022, in terms of what was happening during some of those emergency conditions and very tight days. So I think there was sort of a sense of like having a layered approach that provided an even stronger incentive to be available and to during those days in particular was important, and that could be sort of a layered incentive that could work well with different LRA counting rules. But appreciate the feedback as well, Carrie. Any maybe any other comments just in terms of the either process or substance?
Nope, that was it. Yeah, thank you, Partha. That was helpful.
Good, Carrie.
Next in the queue, we have Bonnie Blair. Go ahead, Bonnie. Looks like we lost Bonnie. Bonnie, go ahead and join the queue again if you still had a question. There, I see Bonnie. Please unmute Bonnie.
Hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me now? Good. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
This is Bonnie Blair. I work with the Six Cities group. I have a question about option 2, and that is, how would this interact with, I can't remember whether it's energy assistance transfers or emergency assistance transfers, but the mechanism whereby a BAA that is going to fail the RSE test can activate transfers from other systems.
Bonnie, that would be a separate procurement mechanism outside of kind of the context of what we're discussing with that second bookend approach for replacing RAAIM with the EDM RSE.
But then if I get that, I guess, but then if you opt in for, is it energy assistance or emergency assistance? I can't remember what the E stands for, but if you opt into EIA transfers, then you don't fail the RSE test, correct? So if you opt into EIA transfers, you get EIA transfers, you don't fail the RSE test, then would this option 2 approach be triggered or not triggered?
Right. So for assistance energy transfers, there is a slightly different timeline that's considered, and it's a different procurement mechanism that occurs.
So does that mean the answer is it is that the option 2 mechanism would not be triggered because the BAA would not fail the RSE test?
You would fail the test, but your transfers would not be locked as a result.
But then there would be no penalty for failing the test, but there would be a cost to the BAA for the EIA transfers, right? Or EA.
Maybe, Bonnie, I can take a step back, and we have a number. We've walked this through with some of our EDAM implementation folks at a high level in terms of what it might look like. I don't know it's been sort of fully mapped out in terms of sort of what the timing and iteration would look like with the various EDAM rules. I think the concept is basically the idea of that both for from a policy levels, that both for times when the BA is going to pass and or the times that the BA is going to be providing assistance and getting EDM revenue associated or getting revenue associated with from other EDM BAs, that non-performing resources would basically be allowed to get extra compensation and or would sort of have some sort of financial penalty or charge depending upon that circumstance. And so I think that we'd, if there was sort of a push by the stakeholder group to say, yeah, that's a better pathway, I think we'd have to go map it out. But I think from a policy perspective, the idea would be if we are short in some respect, and there are costs and or some penalties, then those would be sort of passed along pro rata to non-performing generators. And we have some examples to go through, but I think to your point, there are probably additional details about how this would all fit together and how it would work with the EDAM design. But probably right now what we're looking for is that high level feedback of this is a concept we would like you to consider more, or no, this is maybe a step too far, and we really think that either the RAAIM reform path and or maybe Carrie alluded to a different path is sort of the right way to proceed in developing a revised incentive mechanism. Does that make sense, Bonnie?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I guess it sounds to me like you would need to dig into some of the interactions with the other EDAM, and well, it's not just EDAM, it's also I think it's also yeah, it is, because it's in place now, the energy assistance transfer mechanism.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I think the goal would be to have something that works seamlessly between them, but really the idea would be, yeah, whoever's failing, if the CAISO BA is failing for the EDAM, then that's when it would basically be kicking in some sort of mechanism. And I think what you're getting at is that there might be some sort of fine line on what does it mean for the CAISO BA to be failing. I think that's probably maybe where there's the shade of gray that we probably might need to go back and sharpen our pencil a little bit to make sure that those are all lined up correctly. But yeah, thanks, Bob.
yeah, I think that yeah, it's a design point, I think. But
yeah.
Okay, thanks.
I guess, Christina, just one question. Could we promote Danny Johnson to panelist to also respond to Bonnie?
Yes. Stacey, could you please unmute Danny Johnson? His name shows as Daniel Johnson.
Okay, I think it promoted me. Yeah, this is Danny Johnson with the CAISO. And Bonnie, I think I can help provide a little more background on AET. It's really a real-time market-only product. The way the WAM is structured is that once the EIM RSC fails, a BA's import or export transfers as a result would become locked. So you can't have incremental transfers. So the AET just allows that BAA to opt in to receive incremental transfers at a additional surcharge. So when you look at this from the context of bookend 2, that's really the EDAM RSC, which is a very different design. There isn't an optionality of curing or not curing a shortfall. The design was to always cure the shortfall, but at a cost. And so that option is talking about, should there be more granular cost allocation if a shortfall occurs? There might be a third option, just kind of thinking about your comments, is should the AET transfer surcharge be allocated differently? And to the extent that that's what you're getting at, that would definitely be another alternative that we could consider in this process. But hopefully that context helps, and happy to answer any questions.
I don't know if you can, yeah, it looks like you can still hear me. Yeah, that does help. That helps. And I had, I guess I was conflating the real time and the day ahead situations. So that's helpful.
The danger of living in our world of acronyms.
All right, thanks.
Thanks, Bonnie. Next in the queue, we have Doug Karpa. Go ahead, Doug. Looks like we lost Doug. Doug, go ahead and join the queue again if you still had a question. In the meantime, we'll move to the next person in the queue. So we'll go to Tong Wu. Go ahead, Tong.
Wu from WAPA. I have two questions. The first question is whether RAAIM would apply to a generator in a EDAM BAA that provides RA for load inside of ISO BAA?
Yes, as contracted capacity to the ISO BAA, it would be subject to RAAIM.
Okay. Thank you. My second question, first, I will say I like the concept of option 2 because for option 2, the ISO is looking at RA from operation point of view instead of taking on enforcement responsibility on behalf of the LRA. So from that perspective, I like option 2. I think that's the right direction, although there might be some details that need to be worked out. My understanding is that whether the RSE fail or not inside California ISO is at the BAA level. I think to make sure that the penalty is not socialized, it would be good if you look at RSE failure at the SC level. So some SCs, they contract for RA and they have resource efficiency, and so they should not be allocated any penalty because some other SC did not meet their resource efficiency. Does that make sense?
Maybe one clarification, is your recommendation to look at penalties at the SC level related to how EDAM RSC works today, or is it related to option 2 where the suggestion is to allocate the cost to the individual resources that don't meet their must offer?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of option 2 and future RSE allocation.
Okay.
Yeah, for example, let's say I have generators and I try to meet my load in the ISO, and I make sure that for every hour, my generator will meet the load. So I'm providing RA for my load, and also I'm providing resource efficiency for my load. I track my load. But on some other hours, I may not provide the same amount of RA. For example, at 8 p.m., when load is very high, let's say it's 100 megawatt, my load is 100 megawatt. So I dispatch my generator to meet my load. I make sure I have more than 100 megawatt there, according to whatever, percentage. Let's say 15%, I'll provide 115 for 8 p.m. But for 8 a.m., my load is half of that, 50 megawatt. So I'm not going to provide 115 megawatt. There's no reason for me to do that. However, RA is not hourly. So if somebody else at 8 a.m. fail their RSE, so the ISO, from BAA point of view, fails RSE at 8 a.m., I don't think I should be allocating any penalty. So I'm saying that, so the RSE assessment, the responsibility and the penalty, RSE penalty, eventually should be determined at SC level. And also, if RAAIM penalty is related to RSE failure, it should be at SC level as well.
There is the recognition, and maybe I've kind of simplified things in this portrayal when I recognize that resources are all represented by an SC, and that penalty would kind of flow to the SC. But I'm not sure if I'm fully capturing your recommendation here.
Yeah, and maybe, Tom, we can build off of it. I think at the highest level, we are, one of the things I'll recognize from one of your earlier comments, I think we recognize the fact that as part of our track 3 backstop process, there's going to be maybe a separate conversation around the allocation of basically holistic backstop reforms, including potentially correcting EDM RSE failures and the mechanisms the CAISO BA has to do that, as well as the allocation of costs between different load serving entities. And so I think there's probably a much more nuanced conversation that will need to happen in that venue as to, between potentially different LRAs and LSCs, is there a subset that are sort of driving the cost, and we should be looking at that allocation differently? I think for this, we're really more focused upon reforming RAAIM and what are effective incentive mechanisms that are applied to resources that are shown as RA to perform in emergency or tight conditions, or for this case, when it's needed to support and pass the EDM RSE for the BA. So I think that's really the tension right now, is we're just trying to figure out the incentive levers, when it should be applied, what are those price thresholds, and issues like that. But I think that broader conversation around who is the correct party between LLCs, we'll probably need to have, we're planning on having it later in this year as a part of that track 3 discussion.
Yeah, maybe this is the first conversation as the proposal, as ISO continues to develop a proposal, there may be additional opportunities for us to communicate. And also, if you want, we can talk offline.
That was great. Yeah, thank you, John.
Thanks.
Thank you. Next, let's go to Doug Karpa.
What's going on here? It's my meeting.
Doug, you're coming in a little bit faintly.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize I was off mute. Thank you. I seem to have lost the window where the meeting is. So, Doug Carpa, Peninsula Clean Energy, having just a fabulous Monday. My question, and I apologize, I came a little bit late, so I may have missed this, but in terms of thinking about how RAIM penalties and exemptions from them work, what is the current thinking about how if the application of penalties would apply to UCAP resources if resources are taking a hit to their accreditation and that is accounted for in their value shown for RA, does that mean that they then would not be assessed RAIM penalties on top of that? How are you thinking that would work? And you can mute me again too, because I can't find my mute.
No problem. Doug, that's a great lead into our next section.
Oh, okay.
So our next discussion, and so maybe save your questions for after we go through some examples, but I think in light of UCAP, some of the discussions we've been having internally are really related to, what value do we assess performance against? And should it remain the must-offer obligation, or should there be a new data point that we assess availability against that I'll refer to as the performance benchmark megawatts in the future, on future slides? So that discussion's coming up, but great segue once we get through some more of these questions. Partha, anything to add? No.
Not on my end, no, thank you.
Thanks. Next, we'll go to Perry Cervedio. Go ahead, Perry.
Hey, this is Perry Cervedio, California Energy Storage Alliance. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. No, I had that last point by Doug was a good one, but I guess I can hold my question on that. I would maybe high level. Can you go back to the slide that has the two bookends on it? What I'm going to try, I have a couple of questions just to figure this out. And what I'm trying to get to is this question of around flexible RA here. So, and like, if we did do the RSE failure approach, how much that would look like today's assessment or not, both from a local system MOO and a flexible MOO perspective. So my first question is just can you just remind me, RSE design, is that assessed essentially every hour of every day?
Harry, I appreciate kind of the discussion around Flex, and we're going to have a separate Flex initiative to really kind of delve into that and merge with this initiative. But right now, we're really just focused on generic RA. Did you want to add anything, Partha?
Yeah, I think that between your comment and Carrie's comment, we had this conversation internally quite a bit on can this be bifurcated and does that make sense? I think from a policy perspective, we're hoping to advance the generic discussion in particular, and then turn to Flex. But it might be the case where at some point in time we recognize that these need to merge, because that's really where, that's really kind of the foundational question, is how do we have an effective design where people have to meet both requirements and might have different incentive mechanisms depending upon, as you alluded to, the increased obligations. There is a 24/7 move for all these resources anyway, or at least I'll say, this isn't, the assessment hours isn't meant to sort of limit what their move is, but it might be sort of different incentive structures that are applied between Flex versus generic, and what might look like different obligations to perform depending upon if you're just Flex or just generic too. So. Yeah, thank you, Gary.
Yeah, I do have some questions, because to the extent that we can talk about this, within this next 3 minutes or so, out in the open here, you might get some better comments on this from other stakeholders as well. So just for clarity's sake, could you remind me if the RSE would, I'm looking mainly on, say, this right side of this slide, if that is assessed every day and every hour?
Yes.
Okay. So in a way that could align with like a 24-hour MOO, although that looks a lot different from how RAIM's real assessment is not on a 24-hour basis. So we could, have that discussion. And then the other piece that sort of jumps out at me is to understand the magnitude of the potential penalty. I'm recalling that it's some kind of multiplier on LMP for an RSE failure. Can you clarify what we would be looking at a potential magnitude of penalty? Understanding it's a BA wide, but I'm just curious what that price looks like.
It's really contingent on the kind of the procurement of imports that would have to be procured in a 4-hour block. We've got some examples coming up later that are very conservative in that it's looking at the kind of upper bounds of that spectrum, looking at $1,000 per megawatt hour import block RA prices. So I think we'll get to some of that in our examples when we look at the cost allocation settlement under both designs. But there's, more work to be done. I realize, the RAIM examples that we have are really based on today's incentive levels, and some of our question relates to, are those incentive levels the right ones? And when it comes to the EDM RSE, there is that need to procure imports on behalf of the BAA, and so that's the basis for those costs, which are really dependent on import prices. So stay tuned is maybe my recommendation on that front.
I think I get that. It is the multiplier of LMP. Where you choose that LMP and whatnot is different. But am I right that it's a multiplier on the LMP? I'm just trying to get a sense.
There's a cost basis of what the imports are procured at, and then there is a credit based on kind of the LMP for the non-failing hours. So we'll kind of have more discussion coming up there, and I think some of our discussion is also going to include, should there be cost caps if we move towards this second bookend approach? So that's another kind of question to consider. Did you want to?
Yeah, and I'll just add, essentially, and like Anya said, there's more information in the future slides, but if you're looking into this, we're not proposing changes to the surcharge calculation, so you can look at the existing surcharge methodology. We're just talking about how to allocate the cost of the surcharge and who pays it.
I understand that. That's why I'm asking. I'm trying to get a sense of the magnitude of the surcharge penalty, just for comparison's sake here.
Definitely.
I think I'm hearing from you guys that it, in a way, is a multiplier on LMP. I think that sort of aligns with where Hong was going on. It's more closely tied to the operational need within the day ahead.
Perry, I do want to clarify that it is not a multiplier of LMP. It is kind of the procurement costs at hub prices, and then there is a credit based on kind of the LMP in those non-failing hours. So I just want to clarify that for the group.
Okay. So, just to compare it to today's $3 and whatever per kilowatt hour, are we looking at this as potentially being higher than that, or mostly being higher than that when we're in a condition of RSE failure?
It depends on what those import prices are, and to the extent that we develop cost caps. So, Partha?
There's various levers, Perry, so I think that's probably not a yes or no question. I think from the highest policy goal, I think we're obviously wanting to have this be an effective incentive for it to be availability during these hours. And so will it be higher, during an hour we fail? I would think the answer would be probably. I think there's various ways that we were thinking about it in terms of, capping or mitigating the impact. I think what we heard from almost all participants was, yes, you might want to have a reasonably high incentive mechanism during these critical hours, especially if there are fewer of them that they're being subject to. Yes, you might want to allocate the appropriate share of the EDM RSC failure charge to generators to be available, but also there might be the case where you don't want it to be draconian such that it causes undue risks to parties that could impact contracts, could impact people's positions. So I think there's a number of levers that could help mitigate or change that depending upon how it was designed. So I think kind of question one is, does one of these frameworks meet the needs better? And then the question two is, how should those individual levers be included together to sort of best balance the various priorities?
Okay. My next question was related to the extent to which RSE, this is all exploring the right side again here, is the extent to which RSE is evaluating economic bids. I understand that, you know, there has to be a certain amount of flexibility provided, some upward and downward sufficiency. Could you confirm that there is an assessment of the amount of flexibility needed in a given hour within RSE?
Yeah, I might phone a friend, and Danny, since you're the CAISO's EDM RSC expert, would you like to speak to that? Is it 24-hour?
Sure. Yeah, sure. So Perry, the way that EDM RSC is going to work is it's actually going to be another market run within the day-ahead market process. So it's going to look at each BAA and look at all of the supply offers made throughout the day, and then determine can the market feasibly schedule to meet that BA's load, AS, and imbalance reserve requirements across that next day.
Okay, and in terms of, I'm just trying, in my head, I have that there's some sort of upward failure insufficiency and downward failure insufficiency, and I read that as there's some sort of assessment on economic bids from a BA perspective. Is that the right lens?
It's using the bids. It's using the supply offers made by all the SCs.
Okay,
and trying to see if you can optimally schedule and I think minimize the surplus variables that any of those three commodities would take.
Sure, and then I think your point was then, and I think you were saying it earlier, is that within that day-ahead market, there actually is an exchange of revenue in terms of imbalance reserves. You know, it sounds like suppliers would be getting paid to provide that sort of flexibility. Is that right?
I'm a little lost on that last kind of question. Can you help me?
The way I was just looking at it was like, well, there is an imbalance reserve price that suppliers are going to get paid to provide flexibility, and I understood that there are imbalance reserve sort of requirements, if you will, in the same sense of there's some sort of flexibility required to be in there on a BA level. Is that right?
The imbalance reserves are rolling out as part of EDM and DAME, and you're right that there's a separate imbalance reserve price that commodity will be paid. And in the context of EDM RSC is just trying to determine if the total amount of requirements can be met.
Okay. And that sort of assessment happens first before we go and settle or figure out the pricing and settle the imbalance reserves.
Yeah. A good way to think of this is like the EDM RSC is going to be similar to like the MPM pass of the day-ahead market. It's just literally another pass within the sequence.
Okay. So I'm hearing there is sort of a flexibility requirement, if you will, which would require some sort of upward or downward flexibility. I think that part comes from maybe the imbalance reserve offer requirements.
No, it comes in part from the imbalance reserve requirements, but it's trying to look if the schedules can be met across all 24 hours. So it kind of is implicitly testing if the set of supply offers can meet the projected needs throughout the entire day. So imbalance reserves kind of layer on top of the hourly movement of, say, demand, for example.
Yeah. Okay. You know, that gets at where I was you know, much more clearer in my head now, but it's getting at, I think, the point that I wanted to, if you all to think about further, was to the extent that the RSE is doing some assessment on required flexibility. I think then we can think about the extent to which flex RA is still needed. I think going into real time, day ahead's job would be to make sure that there is enough flexibility, because any of the cleared imbalance reserves clearly will then have a requirement to bid flexibly into the real time market. I think it's this day ahead piece that I'm trying to figure out how much flex RA would be implicated. On the cost side, Bonnie and Tong were sort of hitting on this, but I'd say that I think it would be a good lens and a good separate discussion topic to have, to work through what sort of costs would CAISO, BAA, participating resources and loads be subject to based on the RSE, and any other, you know, thing going on that would require that would basically mean we don't have enough supply in some way. So Bonnie was getting at that from the angle of assistance energy transfers. I think she was trying to, or her understanding was that perhaps with assistance energy transfers in real time, it's not necessarily an RSE failure per se, but there is still a cost that loads would incur if that happened, you know, if CAISO is short from that perspective. And I'd say that, you know, it's probably a good lens to think about what those costs are, because that's truly then, you know, failure to have enough bids leading to CAISO BAA incurring costs. It seems like that would squarely be within, you know, what as close to day ahead and real time cost of not having those bids are. So I that was a little bit jumbled, but I'm saying I sort of like the idea of exploring down that road, because what we had talked about in our latest round of comments on MURA was the idea of what really is the replacement cost of that capacity, like what costs are actually being incurred, and then tying the penalty in some way to that actual cost. That also gets to, I think, what Tong was saying, which is that he said from his perspective, he liked the idea that this was really, the RSE side of this would be really focused on your actual operational needs at the time, and it is getting at, you know, your operational need for bids, whether they be self schedules or economic bids. So I'd say I'm interested enough, and I think that it would be worth exploring from that lens of what are the costs that loads could potentially incur due to RSE failures, assistance energy transfers, whatnot, and then see if there's a way, if it's appropriate then for some sort of you know, RAAIM, you could call, whatever you end up calling this, to basically be finding a way to allocate those costs out as penalties, and then to the extent that that there are payments, how to allocate those payments out to, say, the good performers. And then I'll leave that's my last sort of, I'd say, comment on that. And then I'll leave I'm hearing you that you have some conversation on performance benchmarks later. That's the other side. Once you've figured that out, then it's like, okay, well, what really is my obligation to perform? How are you going to calculate that? But I understand, Anya, you said you have some slides later on that.
Thank you, Perry. Yeah, looking forward to kind of feedback on those examples once we go through them, and maybe areas where you'd like to see our examples adjusted for other aspects of procurement, whether that's AAT or something else. Let's go to Patrick.
Thank you.
And just as a kind of just quick check, I think based on our existing questions in the queue, let's go through those, and then we'll move to our next section, just in the interest of time.
Next, we'll go to Patrick.
Cunningham with the Public Advocates Office at the CPUC. I'm a little worried that that these options will shrink the hours that the RAIM would apply to. Ratepayers, it's like with RA contracts, they're funding these RA contracts to meet the must offer obligation, which is 24/7, unless you're a demand response or other use limited cases. And so doesn't seem to be much enforcement at all of the must offer obligation if we have a RAIM that's only looking at certain hours. So I'm wondering what other tools that the CAISO has to enforce the must offer obligation. I know there's bid insertion and full on tariff violations, but I don't see those reported at all or often. So I'm not sure if they're tools that are actually used.
Yeah. I have David Swallow here from legal who could expand on this. Maybe from a policy standpoint, this is obviously a tension that we faced sort of early in this initiative process was what are the implications of that? And at least for, part of I think the way we're looking at it from like a market standpoint, there are probably 3 different incentive levers. Like one is obviously we recognize the fact that from a resource counting perspective, mechanisms like UCAP might have kind of a slightly more broad incentive to be available during a certain subset of hours. So particularly if the PUC has been exploring a UCAP design, we recognize that resource counting, at that resource counting level, you can provide a pretty good incentive for availability. This is obviously more focused on just those type in our emergency conditions, so there's a much more limited application to it. I think more broadly, we recognize that availability is incentive by market prices and the ability to receive revenues from the day-ahead, real-time market. There's also, I think maybe from a legal perspective, and David, correct me if I mess up, there's certainly still a tariff obligation to be available and perform beyond these incentive structures. And so the MOO isn't necessarily changing as much as the application of incentives. I'm getting a thing that's a weird echo right now, which we'll pause.
Yeah, and well, Parker said is correct. I think the
Oh, Patrick, would you mind muting your line for just a moment?
That might be it.
I can come back
right.
on.
I think going back to the start of RAIM, there was the idea, well, why don't you just have RAIM 24 hours to match the 24-hour MOO? And then the concern was, well, what about, unavailability at 3 a.m. versus, 5 p.m.? Those hours aren't equivalent, so you want to start looking at having greater incentive, in the hours of greater need. And then you would say, well, okay, maybe you could still have RAIM, but there would be a higher penalty price in peak hours. And then it just sort of got, the complications snowballed at that point. So that's kind of how we settled on the availability assessment hours that you see in today's RAIM. So then the question is, well, what other measures are there to still enforce the 24/7 MOO? And like Partha said, it is still a raise a tariff obligation. There still is an expectation that parties, unless they're, the resources on outage, will be complying. And but it is in terms of RAIM replacements, in terms of the direct financial incentives to be there, it is a subset of all hours where the tariff-based MOO applies.
Maybe one more thing, Patrick. I'd love to hear more about that in your comments. And if you feel like there is sort of a different way to have, you think that we haven't struck the right balance, that we need to apply this to more hours, we need to have it be a more broad. Love to hear that feedback on what a proposal might look like. We were kind of looking at those 3 different levers of resource counting, this modified incentive mechanism approach, as well as markets to sort of provide that incentive. But if you feel like there's a different approach, love to hear what that would look like. I think we're still open to additional changes from this design.
Thanks. Yeah, we'll comment on that again. But yeah, I'm feeling that the purpose of the RA structure on here is it's listed to incentive availability when RA when and where needed. we don't know when that is. Like, sure, AAH or the available assessment hours are a great stand-in for that, but we don't know if an intertie is going to go down at noon or if we're going to have to deal with morning peaks soon. I feel like the whole point of the must offer obligation to go for 24/7 is to cover those contingencies to make sure reliability is around. And if we aren't enforcing it at all, like 99% of the hours, I don't see RA benefit or reliability benefiting here. And yeah, we'll expand on that in our comments.
Thank you, Patrick. Mohan?
Next. Oh. If we could please unmute Mohan.
Hello, it's CTWR. My first question is, if we go with option 1, there are certain operating procedure in the CAISO, which is also known as system emergency. I think number is 4420, in which certain resources could be called upon by ISO in trying to mitigating the EEA conditions, and those resources could be dispatched, and that could happen, that could cause the exhausting all the RA capacity, maybe for a continuation of the EEA days. And so I think the resources that are subject to the operating procedure 4420, in which generation could be dispatched more than the RA capacity, or the load can be dropped significantly. And so that if the EEA continues for the next day, the resources may not be available. And in those situations, I think CAISOs would consider how those resources would be treated in developing this proposal. That's one thing. And the second is currently there are certain resources that are exempt from RAAIM, and how CAISO is going to look into those resources in this proposal. Third is on the option 2, is there any data resources you have, for example, on the RSC failure charges and payments? So for historical data, let's say last 1 year or 2 years, if there are such data, it would be interesting for us to look into in determining which option is good before commenting.
And Mohan?
Yeah.
One clarification, I think I heard that, maybe just let me play that back, but was your feedback on how to think about operating procedure 4420, by which the CAISO has operational procedures to dispatch resources once we are kind of in critical conditions to the proposal? And then the second point, was that related to kind of reconsidering some of the exemptions or clarifying it in the proposal?
Yeah, that is correct. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I wasn't sure if I heard that correctly. And then the third aspect was that more of a data request in terms of looking at resource payments and penalties as a result of RAAIM? Because we do have kind of in our market planning and performance report kind of a summation of the RAAIM kind of payments and penalties.
Yeah, I think the third question is about having data by hourly, because you mentioned that RSC failure is tracked based on hourly. So if there are data, then we could look into those particular hours where the RSC failures occurs versus resources unavailability within CAISO. So that was the intent.
And I recognize, we have somewhat some challenges in that with that third item. So first, EDM isn't up and running, and kind of the resource sufficiency test is a new market run that would occur to kind of assess if CAISO has a reliable day-ahead operating plan. And so that hasn't been done historically, but at least in terms of, and kind of if your goal is to backcast the hourly penalty that might be at play, our current data that we do have is really for those RA penalties and payments, which are really based on monthly netting. But we can see if we have any of that data at an hourly level.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you,
So,
Mohan.
thanks.
Last question in the queue, we have Eric Johnson.
Pasadena. My question was actually very closely related to what Mohan just asked for, but it just seems that the tiered approach seems to take into consideration a failure beyond RA unit outages. So is our current RA structure sufficient to where we can always pass these resource efficiency exams? And I think that that's, you can use whatever you're using for resource efficiency in the future and truly backcast to see if our RA fleet would take care of this. I get it in the case of an outage, but it just seems that this takes it to another level once you get to your tier 2 and then take it to meter demand. When would it get to that point? RA should capture this. And if it's more than just outages, then that means that our RA structure isn't sufficient. So I would really like to know that before we can really determine if this is something valid. If it just went to those that didn't meet their RA, that's one thing. But once you start having to take that to the next step and go to meter demand, if meter demand already provided all their RA, how is this balancing authority area failure really their fault?
And this is where, there's a recognition that RA is a planning exercise, looking at reliable conditions, typically through the lens of 1 and 2 events. There might be cases where, on a day-ahead basis, load levels exceed our planning assumptions for 1 and 2, and therefore the RSC obligation would be higher potentially than the RA obligation. And so that is kind of some of the recognition of it may not be RA that's the driver, but if there had been other resources that had been available to the EDAM RSC, that failure would not have occurred. But great questions, and hopefully some of our examples tee that up. Anything to add? Okay. All right. Well, great dialogue and great input ahead of our straw proposal. I think at this point, we're going to take a quick, maybe 8-minute break if we can all be back at 10:40, and we'll continue on to the next section on the must offer obligation and UCAP. So a quick 10-minute break, and we'll be back at 10:40. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back from the break. We'll be getting started here again shortly.
Great. I think we're ready to get started in the room, and we can stay on this slide for a moment. So thank you, everyone, for sticking with us. This next discussion really focuses on our must-offer obligations and UCAP. Many of you that were part of the working group phase recall many discussions related to needing to go back to our must-offer obligations as a part of RAIM reform efforts. And our goal is that any of our move clarifications or refinements make sure that those obligations are clear, measurable, and aligned with both operational reliability needs and planning constructs. In future discussions, we will have clarifications to the must-offer requirements, particularly for hybrid and co-located, which came up in our working group phase. But here, our discussion focuses on UCAP and kind of a new exploration of if the must-offer obligation alone remains the appropriate basis for assessing resource performance, or if we should have a different value, one that more closely reflects what a resource can realistically deliver in real time. And part of that is discussing how known operational constraints that may not be available in real time, such as ambient D rates for thermal resources or full back limits for storage, if they should be reflected in performance measurements so that the expectations are both credible and achievable. And we're having this discussion to prepare for possible UCAP-based rules and how that translates into our day-ahead obligation. And overall, we're looking to have this conversation to make sure that the framework really does work across all LRAs in our DAA. So with that, let's move to the next slide. I've hit on the purpose, but in terms of why now, we recognize that CPUC may consider adopting UCAP. The CAISO's default rules are soon going to incorporate UCAP, and we're hoping that this proactive design avoids future rework or inconsistent treatment. We do recognize that not all local regulatory authorities in our balancing authority area currently use or plan to use UCAP. The CPUC has not adopted UCAP in a final decision, and to our knowledge, no other LRA has adopted UCAP. So that's some of the context of why we're having this discussion and some of the reminders we want to keep in mind. Next slide. Our business practice manuals for reliability requirements and our tariff both outline the must-offer obligations for generic RA. And this is just a simplified table to show those generic RA requirements, but it's here to remind folks that counting for RA does come with a must-offer, and that must-offer requires resources to submit offers into the market when it's physically available and not on a scheduled or forced outage. For most resource types, that means 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, when they're available to serve energy. And these offers reflect the resource's maximum physical capability to provide energy or load reduction if their demand response at a certain time, subject to physical limitations or D rates. There are some exceptions. Some resource types are not required to submit offers for every obligation. So certain demand response products or variable energy resources may have tailored offer requirements tied to their expected availability or forecasted capability in the case of FERS. Let's move to the next slide. So as I mentioned on our intro slide here, we want to explore whether the must-offer obligation alone remains the appropriate basis for assessing resource performance, or if we should look to a new value to measure that obligation against in a way that more accurately reflects what a resource can realistically deliver in real time. So we're going to kind of walk through this table, and then we have a couple of examples coming up. And this table, along with those future examples, explore a few resource types where portions of capacity may not be operationally available in real time. So you can think about ambient D rates for thermal units or foldback limitations for storage. And this is really intended to raise the question of if performance should be evaluated as a full must offer or against an adjusted benchmark that better reflects expected availability, and recognizing the UCAP counting kind of does separate kind of the RA counting versus the current must offer.
Before we do that, you might add just a little bit, and at least to set a little bit of the context as well. Obviously, for our current design mechanism, RAIM is applied during specific hours, that we have the RAIM availability assessment hours, and that there's a lot of exemptions for resources from being subject to RAIM, but in general, for the people who are applied, you're expected to be available and bid and subject to those rules for, let's talk about generic RA, subject to those sort of current RAIM rules and availability assessment hours. So part of how we got to this was a part of our redesign. A couple of things we heard were, one, some of those exemptions and some of those are causing bad incentives. And so we should basically look at applying sort of a more broad application of our availability incentive mechanism to all resource and resource types. And the second thing we really discussed was that honing in on, we've been having a discussion on what are the critical hours, but then the question is, within those critical hours, how do we judge and evaluate resource performance? And that's where we really got as the MOO. And so the MOO was really kind of like, this is what the resource is sort of signing up to do, this is what it's saying it can do, and that we are looking, and that really requires is now a more honed look at, for different resource types, are we really looking at the MOO in the right way, and that particularly as the CPUC and others are looking at UCAP, are we thinking about the MOO in the right way, given the resource value shown, and then as well as Anya alluded to, is there a performance benchmark that might look different than the MOO that we should consider? So that's the policy context around it, is really kind of maybe a redefinition of the assessment windows, but also kind of really a honing in on the MOO and the requirements for the different resource types, given the fact that we're going to be looking at performance really based upon, the starting point was really kind of based on that MOO from a policy standpoint. So.
Thanks. So I'm going to walk through this slide and a couple examples and then open it up to questions. But here's where we're having that exploration of if there should be a differentiation between the MOO and essentially kind of a new value to assess RAIM against, whether that is for kind of our two bookend approaches, whether that's for a RAIM reform option or for the EDM RSD, since both are based on, did this resource make themselves available up to their must offer? Do we want that to be the MOO in both cases or an RA performance benchmark? And to the extent that it is more of an RA performance benchmark, what factors should go into that? So for thermal resources, UCAP reflects the statistical availability across the year. It's not a daily operating limit. Thermals can physically provide their PMAX every day. And so the the must offer is based on PMAX. But I think this is where we have an open question of, should the assessment of performance account for ambient D rates, recognize if those ambient D rates are known ahead of time, recognizing that on a hot day, this resource would not be able to provide its full output as a result of those ambient D rates. In a kind of parallel construct for standalone storage, UCAP is approximating the megawatt value a storage asset can achieve for at least 4 consecutive uninterrupted hours without entering in foldback. In addition, UCAP also reflects the statistical availability across the year based on forced outage rates. And I think this is where we have a similar open question of, should the assessment of performance account for foldback recognizing that as we kind of get into the outer bounds of the state of charge, the resource can enter in foldback, which can limit the available megawatts available, that Pmax will be lower, et cetera. So let's go to the next slide. And this just adds kind of a visual and numerical examples looking at potentially including a performance benchmark megawatt value for thermals and in a couple of slides storage. So if, for example, we have a resource that, as you see in the graphic below, has a Pmax of 100 megawatts. However, the ambient D rate that it expects to have on a hot day is 10 megawatts, and it has a historical forced outage rate of 2 megawatts. From a shown perspective, if that value reflects kind of forced outage rate and ambient D rate, maybe the shown value is 88 as a way to convey to the CAISO what the unit can reliably provide under expected ambient conditions. Our tariff requires the must offer to be all available physical capacity, which is at 100. And we have the open question of if during a hot day when that ambient D rate kind of is reflected to the CAISO, if the performance benchmark by which we would assess performance, whether that is kind of the EDM RSE approach or the RAIM reform approach, if that should be really 90 megawatts, meaning if a resource were to bid 80, they would essentially have a 10 megawatt shortfall that RAIM or the replacement would be assessed against. Next slide. Just for completeness of examples, we thought it might also be helpful to consider a similar resource that might be partially deliverable, maybe it's only 50% deliverable, and partially contracted. Maybe this SB only has 75% of kind of that contract. And really what you're seeing in this example is kind of similar approach, except for each of the columns is multiplied by the percent deliverable and the percent contracted. And so here, rather than, even though the Pmax of the resource is 100, and we still have those similar examples of a 2 megawatt forced outage rate, a 10 megawatt ambient D rate, here we're layering on what's deliverable and shown, which means that the shown value would be 33. We're not taking into account the ambient D rate in the MOO, and therefore the total must offer is 37.5 megawatts, whereas the performance benchmark megawatt number, by which kind of is our assessment point for assessing RAIM or its predecessor, would take into account that ambient D rate and really is intended to represent what the unit's physically capable of delivering in real time. Next slide. And now we have an example for storage under UCAP. And the kind of approach taken considers foldback and then also considers kind of a historical forced outage rate. And so there's a recognition in that first column that when the NQC is developed, it's really based on what can be dispatched for 4 continuous uninterrupted hours without entering foldback. And so there is kind of a recognition of some foldback over the course of 4 hours. And then from a UCAP perspective, that it also includes kind of the total forced outage rate for that resource over the course of the year. Our current tariff does obligate the resource to offer all capacity. However, again, kind of considering this new concept of what should the performance be assessed against, should we have a performance benchmark that is really looking to reflect what the physical energy limits of the resource are? And so should the performance benchmark megawatts be 90 rather than 100 for the storage resource, so that anything bid under that would be assessed a RAAIM or RAAIM successor penalty? So today we don't model foldback, and it's included in outage rates. Next year we will be modeling foldback, and so the market will be able to kind of pull in that foldback value based on where the state of charge of that resource is. And so that would be a data stream to kind of understand what is operationally available based on the state of charge of a given resource. And maybe with that, I'll pause and see if there are any questions on this kind of question that we have related to how we should think about the must offer, or if kind of the introduction of UCAP also introduces this question of availability limits, and if we want to kind of take a new approach.
Yeah, and I'll probably to reiterate some of the things that Anya already said. I think what we heard from participants was a variety of perspectives on this to date, where, particularly as the PUC is, likely to adopt a UCAP mechanism, there's kind of this question around, like UCAP certainly could be effective from a planning and from a procurement standpoint. There's kind of some feedback of that shouldn't necessarily change to really there's let's just say a historical forced outage, what the move is into the CAISO's market from an operational standpoint. But then that probably brought a lot of questions just in terms of how do we operationalize this now with maybe different shown values, different performance obligations. And so really what we're trying to get for participants is, from an implementation standpoint, from a commercial standpoint, what are the right ways to think about this? Is there a specific path? So the way I kind of think about the three options is, could be based upon the obligation, how performance is, could be based upon PMAX, or it could be just based upon the UCAP value shown to us, or then for that third performance benchmark, maybe there's a middle ground solution that the performance obligation has some of the UCAP component, but not all of it in terms of how we're assessing it. So lots of like basically policy and implementation trade-offs that I think we're trying to wrestle with here. Maybe one other thing, I read Patrick Cunningham's argument, his question on there. I think we weren't necessarily at the level, we were certainly wanting to work for the commission's UCAP design. We also recognize that there are a number of potential pathways that other participants might have, and from an implementation standpoint, we want to be workable across different designs and programs that might have different counting. So I think that's sort of some of the feedback we're likely looking for from participants is how do we actually operationalize this in a reasonable manner as well. So.
The first question in the queue, we have a question from Tom Wu.
Hi, this is Tom Wu from WAPA. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. I have two questions. One question is, on that list that you showed earlier, I did not see conditionally available resources. Does that mean conditionally available resources are not subject to MOO, or you just missed that one, or that's difficult to explain?
I'll just take that first.
I'll ask the second question later.
I'll just note that it does not mean that we don't have a must-offer obligation for conditionally available resources. That is in our tariff and BPN. It was really just a broad brushstrokes, kind of high-level look at the must-offer obligation for certain resource types.
Okay. Yeah, and that's important to us. It's important to WAPA. So if not here, somewhere, I think would like to hear what's ISO's opinion, what ISO will propose to deal with conditional available resources.
And Tom, could I ask, when you say it's important to WAPA, are you getting at the idea that you'd want to have the design here reflect those conditional limitations and not subject the resources to an unreasonable move and or incentive structure didn't recognize their conditional nature? Is that
Yeah, well, WAPA schedules CVP generation. The CVP project, Central Valley project, has several hydro dam and generators. The power of those generators is a byproduct of water management. So really, power is not something we say, okay, we want to maximize profit or we want to sell energy. So it has a lot of constraints. Water management, even navigation, recreation, recreation. And so I think those generators qualify as conditionally available resources according to ISO's tariff. And according to ISO's tariff amendment that was filed on, I think, July 1st, 2020. So there's some, there is a section that under certain conditions exempt cars from bid insertion and the RAAIM. So with this reform, we're talking about changing the must offer obligation. Also, we're changing how RAAIM is assessed. So I don't want us to overlook that. Maybe, there are not a whole lot of resources under CAR. It doesn't need to be discussed at large stakeholder process, but we don't want omit that. That is important.
Okay. Does that make sense, Tom? And Anya might build off that. One thing I'd say too, to think about for your feedback, obviously, like during the RAAIM assessment hours currently defined today, there might be just some limitations in terms of cars to bid and be available. To agree that one of these designs is focused more upon assessment during emergency conditions and or EDM RC failure hours, what the availability of those resources would look like in general might be something to consider as well in terms of how we design it. From my understanding on just talking to different folks, some of these resources are very available during those critical hours when we really need them. It's more the application to that broader RAAIM assessment hours or giving people historical pain. So love to hear more of your feedback, maybe in comments around how we can design it to work effectively with your RA program.
Yeah, I agree with you. These hydro resources can be very useful to the system when you really need them. They ramp very fast. They can use the water, for a short period of time, and generate a lot of energy. But unfortunately, RA is not assessed on hourly basis, at least now. And you have to, under the must offer obligation, you have to bid at the highest RA showing quantity for all the hours, and that is a problem because you can do that for a few hours, but you cannot do that 24/7, all the time, because you're going to cause problems from water point of view. So yeah, so we need to design the must offer obligation so it does not require 24/7, and also we need to design RAAIM so that it considers the this limitation and think about what is the real impact to operation. It's not about just enforcing some standard on paper. It's rather, is this resource useful? How can we benefit the most out of resource and not discourage the resource from participating? Does not have the wrong incentive so that these resources, very useful resources, are discouraged to participate. We should avoid that.
Thank you, Tong. And again, that table was really just meant for kind of areas where we're seeing a changing QC value, but very much will need to get into the discussion for the must-offer obligation for cars, how we think about it. But.
Yeah, my second question is related to the slide right now you're showing. It's about what is the proper megawatt for must-offer obligation. Maybe I misunderstood it, but it seems to me, many of these columns, the must-offer quantity is greater than what the RA showings are. Maybe I misunderstood that. Yeah.
Yes.
Is that what you're proposing?
That is part of the proposal. It does recognize that the question for consideration is if there should be a different value. So I don't want to frame this in terms of a proposal, but rather a question. But there is a recognition that our tariff does have kind of an obligation to bid that must offer, but should we have performance assessed against a different value? And in these examples, you're seeing where that assessed value, the performance benchmark megawatts, is lower.
Yeah, can you show the previous slide? I thought it was higher. So CPUC NQC is 33 megawatt, and MOO is 37.5. So are you saying that the resource is obligated to bid for 37.5, even though their RA showing is only 33? Or I misunderstood that?
You know what, I may have a typo here, and they should be the same value. Oh, no.
And so this should be 33.
Sorry,
okay.
No, it should be 33, just recognizing we are expecting the performance, so this is correct, but that third column for performance benchmark megawatt value, it is higher because we are expecting those 2 megawatts of forced outage that from a UCAP perspective are kind of statistically considered, kind of derate that capacity. That's kind of a historical look at what's been provided. But on a single day, we would expect those 2 megawatts of forced outage to materialize and bid in. And so that's why you're seeing the performance benchmark as higher than the shown value as well.
How about the MOO? What is should be the right number for that column?
That's a great question. So the must offer here is really tied to kind of our current tariff requirements that is based on physical, kind of the physical capabilities of the resource, and it's based off of the Pmax. So it is also a higher value than both what is shown and that performance benchmark megawatt value.
Yeah, I think probably that needs to change. So if my generator sold 33 megawatt to somebody for RA, and then ISO require me to show more than that, I don't think that's appropriate.
But the UCAP value is taking in kind of a historical look at on average, what can be provided across the year, whereas on a single day, we would expect kind of those values to be available to the market. Prices. Yeah.
Yeah, no,
So what would be the showing quantity in RA?
I'm sorry, say that again? I didn't quite hear you.
So during the RA showing process, they say, you know, October every year, the generator has to show on the supply plan, what is the amount they're obligated to because they received the money for that. They sold that capacity as RA. And there's a quantity, assume is 33. If the generator sold 33 megawatt of RA to the load serving entity, and the 33 megawatt is shown on the supplier sheet. So now, a few months later, in the day-ahead market, is the generator obligated to show 33 or something based on their PMAX, even though they did not sell RA for the PMAX?
Yeah. And yeah, Tom, thanks for that. I think that is the tension we're really trying to get from stakeholders is that there is a trade-off. From a planning and procurement standpoint, one could argue that 33 is the right number because that's what they procured. But there's kind of a question of, is for like really for this partially contracted, is it really kind of the performance benchmark amount, or is it sort of a D-rated amount based on the PMAX? So yeah, I think that's the right tension. But thanks, Tom.
You cannot
I know we
ask somebody for something for free.
Yeah, I think that's you're getting at the right tension and question that we're looking for feedback on. But I know if we have a number of more callers on here, so I want to make sure we can get to everybody. But yeah, thank you, Tom. Super helpful discussion.
Next in the queue, we have Nick Pappas. Go ahead, Nick.
Question is actually a little bit of a callback to the last presentation, but might have some relationship with this one. I asked it in the chat, but I just wanted to raise my hand and make sure we could clarify. Could you just describe, it was a little bit ambiguous in the slide on the exemptions, with the RAAIM successor or evolution of RAAIM, are you proposing to eliminate the exemption for variable energy resources? And I guess maybe a similar question, if there's any more you could elaborate on potential nexus or changes to the MOO for VERs. Thank you.
Maybe I'll say proposed is probably a little bit of an overstatement. I think what we're trying to, we're based on the stakeholder feedback, we're trying to move for as much as possible for all resource types, having an appropriately defined incentive mechanism. So we recognize that for VERs, there are obviously limitations in terms of what they can perform, as well as what their MOO means is very different for resources than, say, a thermal resource. So we're trying to appropriately shape and evaluate it based upon an appropriate MOO for the resource type. So there's added complexity for different resource types as we move forward. Not a proposal, but I think that's the way we've been thinking about it based on feedback.
Yeah, and I'll just add, Nick, like the must-offer obligation for VER resources is really based on essentially the forecast. Like, is there wind that's blowing? Is the sun shining? And therefore, that forecast is setting the must-offer obligation. And yeah, I will leave it at that.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Thank you. And it sounds like, Partha, from your answer, maybe it would be helpful in comments on the next round to sort of revisit that question that came up during MURA for VERs to hear from stakeholders.
Yeah, if there are nuances, particularly for VERs, I think the more challenging cases are the ones that we have here, at least for myself, in terms of like resources like storage, resources like hybrid resources, where there might be some limitations. How do you sort of balance the UCAP obligation, the RA obligation with sort of what the actual MOO should be for the resources, given these different limitations that might be placed on the resource. So, and have it be implementable and reasonable at the same time. So I think that's often the tension that we're really striking. Yeah, any feedback would be super, super valuable.
That's helpful. Yeah, I think one theme that strikes me, certainly for VERs, but I think this could also potentially apply for storage, is the LRA, sort of the RA planning construct and the LRA requirements are sort of portfolio wide in all hours. And you might be showing RA resources for, let's say, like inframarginal reliability risks. So for instance, like solar in the middle of the day where it's still providing RA value, but that has ceased to become the critical period. And I think you could potentially have some similar instances with storage where availability and dispatch might align with the planning assumptions, but might not play out exactly the same way, sort of as dispatch. This is a theme you guys have heard a lot about around UCAP, but just want to draw that nexus in for VERs to the extent those are in scope for potential RAIM successor. And happy to put some more comments on that and have a sidebar discussion about that as this goes forward. Thank you.
Next in the queue, we have Kathleen Colbert from Vistra.
Great, thank you. Kathleen Colbert, District. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I actually raised my hand back on the initial slide, so I would ask if we could go back. I think it's 2 or 3 slides. As we leave the storage one, I will flag for those who are not parties at the CPUC RA proceeding right now that there are storage qualifying capacity rule proposals. So I appreciate, Anya, that your example was kind of more based on today's QC rules, but did want to make sure folks are aware of that. And confirmation is appreciated. The CAISO is also aware of that.
Yes, thank you, Kathleen.
Excellent. Of course. So keep that in mind, folks, while you look at these examples, is that there's some uncertainty around how the qualifying capacity for storage would be determined both under an ICAP framework and a UCAP framework. The reason I raised my hand is I think that this table is a little unclear, and so I wanted to help clarify before you went into, but let's still make sure we're all on the same page. So the RA counting column, I did want you to be, if you could please confirm for stakeholders that what this is implying is not the default counting rules that were recently adopted. This is the RA counting that you believe is being discussed in the CPUC.
That's the intent here for the sake of the example, and really to make sure that, what we're considering can work with different LRAs. So, and subject to my previous comments on the previous slide that, we recognize those rules aren't finalized, and this is an exploratory conversation.
Yeah, the reason I asked for confirmation is because the default rules adopted ELCC for storage, and so without that explicitly noted in a footnote on the slide, it could be difficult for people to track that on recording and looking back at the content. The other thing that I want to clarify very briefly is, again, there are multiple UCAP proposals that are in play in the RA proceeding. They are currently uncertain. And so part of what I've heard you talk through is your interpretation of one outcome, but it isn't reflective of my understanding of either Vistra's UCAP proposal nor of how I understand Energy Division is intending to implement their proposal. And so for extra context, it's more complicated than a single column. The RA proceeding scope is only system RA showing, not local RA. And under your systems, CAISO systems, we talk a lot about generic RA, which is either system or local, and they're bundled. So from the CAISO procedures, as we're talking about performance assessment, we think about that as generic RA and being neutral to whether it's system or local. I would highly recommend you expand this table, clarify that it's your representation of your understanding of what's being discussed at the CPUC, but be clear that it's system RA, slice of day showing UCAP. The proposal, as I understand it, both from our team and from Energy Division, is that the local RA will remain ICAP as it's out of scope. So we have system RA UCAP, local RA ICAP. The must offer obligation that was proposed in the filing by Vistra explicitly does propose that the must offer obligation to CAISO has to be based on that ICAP counting in recognition of the bundled products. But also, I want to make sure you and others are clear. The reason the MOO has to be the ICAP is because the proposed formulation for the equivalent forced outage rate on demand, the E4D calculation includes in the denominator and several components of the calculation, the net dependable capacity or the net maximum capacity, which is our ICAP equivalent. In order to get an accurate E4D, you have to set the MOO based on that net dependable capacity value. So your discussion is high level, but it's losing the fact that the main core reason you must have a must-offer obligation is we're planning the system to meet an installed reserves need. We're using that installed reserve value, that installed capacity value in the calculation that determines the E4D that is then used in UCAP. And I'm happy if you want to have parties provide more information on the proposed formulations in the future, you can reach out.
Thanks, Kathleen. I think we're looking for one QC value for generic and local, but would love to hear more in comments.
Those nuances, Kathleen, are super valuable to understand. I think the way we're thinking about this is we recognize there's a lot of moving parts at the CPUC that will need to play out, but the idea here was the idea that there would be some UCAP value calculated that accounted for likely forced outage rates and likely ambient D rates in some manner, and that value might be what is shown to us for the purposes of system and local RA, and and there's probably questions, and as well there might be other values that different other LRAs are applying, and so from an implementation standpoint, we recognize that we need to have something that's implementable and simple, but also meet the policy objectives that the policy objectives that the LRAs are trying to achieve and is commercially reasonable for participants. So a lot of moving parts, and what it sounds like from you is some parts that might be still evolving going forward at the CPUC. So yeah, appreciate that feedback, Kathleen.
Next in the queue, we have Perry Cervedio, and we'll be taking just these final 3 hands raised in the interest of time before continuing the presentation. Go ahead, Perry.
Hey, this is Perry Cervedio, California Energy Storage Alliance. A few questions. I wasn't really going to ask a question about this slide, but since it's up, I was just wondering if, the translation of your discussion on this slide is really that to the extent that these sorts of limitations are already reflected in a QC, we shouldn't necessarily be double penalized from a performance evaluation perspective. Is that the translation?
No, not necessarily. And maybe I'll just flag that I think storage is a good example of this, in that from a UCAP perspective, it's really looking at, Partha.
Please go ahead.
From a UCAP perspective, it might look at kind of 4 hours of continuous dispatch that doesn't enter into foldback, but once we kind of are in operations and maybe the state of charge is much lower, we might not receive kind of the full dispatch, and if operationally that's not available, and if we're not able to know about that ahead of time, should that be subject to a penalty as well?
I think that's right. I would have probably said yes to your question, Perry, so maybe it's a nuance of, like, at least for the ambient D rates, there's kind of a, UCAP is accounting for multiple factors, and one of them is, it could account for ambient D rates. It also has a portion that could be accounting for forced outage rates. So to the degree that it's accounting for ambient D rates, and let's just say that it's a hot day in July, and we're running into, either an EDM RSE failure or we're having some sort of EA event, it might be the case where for a thermal plant, that ambient D rate was really planned for, it was included as a part of a haircut to the capacity value. So it's kind of a question around, well, should that really be something that we're having a performance assessment based on, because it really was sort of taken out of the capacity value to begin with. So that's at least how I think about for ambient D rates. Foldback is obviously a little bit different in terms of it being an energy limitation. And Sergio might be able to sort of weigh in on sort of how he views a similar role for foldback, but the idea would be, for me at least, would be kind of like, yes, if it's sort of deducted from the capacity, if it's something that was sort of factored already into the RA counting value, there, that it might not need to have an additional performance assessment associated with lack of performance. But is that how you were thinking about, Perry, or did we?
Yeah, no, that's how I was thinking about it. I wanted to point out that these two things, in a way, while today these could be captured as outages, at some point in the time in the future, actually both of these could be captured, in another way. And for both for thermals, ambient D rates, and for storage foldback, these are operational limitations, but both of these resources in performing are clearly just operating within their design specifications, whether it's due to ambient D rate or foldback. So that's why I liked where you ended there, Partha, to say, okay, it's not to say it doesn't necessarily belong in UCAP. It's just that in a way, as long as these two sorts of limitations are sorted out in the QC itself, then it may look like a double penalty if we start to try to hit it with some sort of other performance penalty. It's in your storage example later, you're already showing that the amount of RA that they can sell, that a storage of the Pmax of 100 megawatts, the amount of RA they can sell has already been derated to 90. So they've already essentially been penalized in that way. Yeah, I'm using the word penalty, but it is what it is, right? Okay, so thanks for that. And then if you could go to the thermal example. And I think this gets at where Tong was going. And it seems like in both the thermal examples and I think in the storage example, there's kind of this assumption here that CAISO is aware of a contracted value. Here it's in this slide, it's shown as sort of a percentage, but whether that's a percentage or a megawatt, the slide assumes CAISO knows the contracted value. And I think that was the gist of the prior slide as well, is CAISO would, if I translate it to the prior thermal slide, if you could pull that one up just so I can see what the value was. Yeah, this one, it sort of assumes that also that we know that it was fully contracted, or say the contracts for the 100 megawatt Pmax, even though its UCAP value say 88. And if we were to know that it's fully contracted in this way to a California load serving entity, then I guess this can make a lot of sense. But am I looking at that right? That you all would be, in order to do this calculation, you would need to be collecting a contracted megawatt value that might differ from the value, say, shown on a supply plan?
I think it would be inherently reflected in the supply plan quantity based on
well, let's go to the next slide then. Based on a percentage, right? So if in this one, your supply plan will I think is what you're saying would show 33 megawatts. And you're saying that is then from that value, you're saying you can derive the percentage? I think you're saying 33 is shown because the 75% contracted.
Is your question, Perry, really about how we would obtain that contracted percentage value?
Whether it be a percentage or a megawatt, I'm asking, because that would be additional information. Today, you get values on supply plans that may be less than the contracted value, right? So I think you run into that same issue here where it looks like you're going to then additionally ask for the contracted value.
Fair point on the kind of implementation consideration of obtaining that value in order to assess the MOO and assess the performance benchmark megawatt value.
Okay, I was, wondering if I was looking at that. That's the piece that sort of, that's the piece that jumped out to me, is how you'd actually do this assessment without that value. I think you would need a contracted value in order to do this as it's outlined here. Okay, could you go to the next slide? I think this is the storage one. Yeah, this is the storage one. So my question here, well, first I wanted to say that I appreciate the recognition on this slide that the foldback has already been incorporated into the QC here. I'm assuming that this is the 400 minus the 40 would be the range that's unaffected by discharge foldback, and then you would divide it by the hour or duration of the resource. So it's already sort of, in a way derated to 90 megawatts. It's this additional 2 that I had the question on. And it really gets to, I think what you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, is that there's a forced outage rate on this resource, E4D, of say 2 megawatts, which would be like 2%, and that would be 2% of the Pmax could be on forced outage. Was I reading that part right?
Yes.
It was determined historically over whatever period of time that there's a 2% forced outage rate. Is that right?
The header for UCAP is really kind of reflecting that those 2 megawatts are a result of kind of a forced outage rate determined by the LRA.
Historical unavailability.
Yeah.
Base forced outage rate.
Yeah. And it's 2%, not 12%, right?
I mean, it resulted in 2 megawatts based on that historic forced outage rate.
Yeah.
Okay. And for this resource, it's 100 megawatt Pmax resource. Maybe I could ask the question. Maybe that will help.
Yeah, the bar chart below is probably the easiest way I could describe it. We recognize that the Pmax might be 100. Some of it might be foldback as a part of a QCD rate. Some of it might be associated with historical performance, aside from foldback, and that's sort of how we're sort of subdividing the capacity for the sake of this discussion.
Yeah, I do maybe have some diagrams that I could share in our comments after, but I would think, I guess I'm asking what your thoughts were on just subtracting the additional 2 rather than say comparing the unforced capacity to the QC, which did incorporate the foldback. So the alternative approach here, this is what I'm just trying to get your perspectives on why you landed here. The alternative approach would be to recognize that a resource of a Pmax of 100 megawatts had forced outage rates of say 2%. That to me looks like I got 98% of my Pmax generally available all the time. But we have this alternate look at say, but we are limited due to this foldback, and that's why the QC is 90. To me, it looks like you'd be looking for the min of those 2 assessments as the number, and which would change this example to be just would it actually change it? It looks like it would end up being that 90 would be the UCAP value here, not 88. How it impacts us, I'll just say, is based on what you're expecting the bidding to be, and this if a UCAP is actually 88, then if we have to provide 2 additional megawatts of bids there, right? It just gets,
Yeah,
that's why I asked the first question, right? Is it really a 12% E4D or is it a 2%?
I think maybe I'll just back up and say that the goal of separating out kind of that first column to look at what could be provided without entering foldback, and that second column to recognize the forced outage rate kind of was separated for simplicity to show that those are two factors that go into the ultimate showing value that is based on kind of 4 continuous hours without entering foldback and a historical forced outage rate. And so that was the objective there, but if you want to put in comments ways to clarify that example, those would be great additions.
Okay. Yeah. I guess in the end, and this might get, I'll transition just to my last point. I think this gets at a little bit of what Kathleen was talking about as well. I think it matters what the actual QC value is that you're going to receive from the local regulatory authority. So in this instance, you know, it looks like we're assuming we're getting essentially the CPUC's QC value, which might be the first column here, but they are going to do a UCAP, and I don't know that their calculation will necessarily come out or should come out to be 88 megawatts. We're still working through that in that proceeding, but assuming whatever that number is, they're also going, you know, if that's the number that they're giving you, they're also going to give you a planning reserve margin that's based on that number. So let's say they do give you 88 megawatts and not some, you know, ICAP a QC value. If they give you 88 megawatts, they also are giving you a planning reserve margin that's based on all of those, you know, 88 megawatts from all of the resources. So in this example, it's not clear to me why a resource should be providing, given that, it's not clear why a resource should be providing more than 88 megawatts of bids, which is also, I think, what Tong was saying is you know that you can meet the 1 and 2 forecast plus planning reserve margin if this resource gives you 88 megawatts of bids. You don't need 90 to meet that PRM. So it wasn't clear to me when we get to the performance benchmark that it should be 90. Any reflection there? That was just my thought, just looking at it.
Yeah, I can appreciate that, Perry, and yeah, I think they include that in their comments. I think that's sort of the tension that we've heard from other parties is that, you know, and like, look for like, you know, the PUC and for, you know, some of the LRAs, some of the other LRAs to weigh in. I think that's maybe the tension is, I think some parties would view that historical forced outage rate should not change what the MOO is and should not change how we're assessing availability from their perspective. So there might be a tension there as well. I think that's the type of feedback we're trying to hear from a variety of parties on is what's the right way to look at what the MOO is, the right way to look at how the ISO is assessing it, given that historical forced outage rate might be good from a contracting and from a long-term procurement perspective, it might not be how we should operationalize it. So, yeah, appreciate your perspectives, Perry.
Okay, and that'll, just to close the loop then, that just gets back to why it might, you know, outages will be incorporated into UCAP going forward. So to the extent that I'm incurring an outage now, that's going to roll into what I can sell next year. But I think it's important to understand that outage is on a PMAX value. So that's why in the first instance, I was just talking about, well, it seems like we should be taking the min of the two values as the actual, whether it be that's what's the UCAP or whether it be that's how we define the performance benchmark. That's what I'm still thinking through, but I think it ties back to what's that actual value and whether it's the min of those two, or if they're additive or you're subtracting, but whether they're additive in this way is in column 2.
I'll maybe just emphasize that the reason that we have that must offer that is higher than that shown value is really that, you know, over time it does improve that UCAP value, and it's based on what the resource can physically provide. So just wanted to
Yeah, no, I'd say, nothing's to prevent this resource from continuing to offer it at above and beyond the 88 or the 90. And no matter what they're offering, if there are outages, that will be incorporated into next year's QC value. So that's why, I was just looking from that perspective, because we had talked about, let's make sure we're not getting sort of double penalized in that way here.
Thank you, Perry.
All right, thanks for the time.
Next, we'll go to Noah Tong. Go ahead, Noah.
This is Noah Tong from Middle River Power. Can you guys hear me?
No,
Coming in a little bit faintly.
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Oh, you're coming in slightly faintly, if you wouldn't mind speaking up.
Yeah, I'll do the best I can. So at the CPUC workshop, right, the CPUC has sort of given some ideas on that the UCAP value would be a CPUC only compliance obligation value, and whereas the NQC value will stay at its current accreditation methodology. Have you given thought about what that would, how that might change your current thought process?
Yeah, and there's probably a lot of different perspectives. I probably won't capture all the ISO perspectives here, but I think that there are sort of a trade-off of, like if the PUC ultimately gave us a different QC value, it's likely, as Perry indicated before, it might come with a different PRM, and there might be some additional complications associated with that, to where if the PUC gave us basically a D-rated value that factored in, like for thermals, let's say ambient D rates and forced outage rates, there might need to be a different system. So I think that we're looking for a program that works for both all our LRAs and works for the ultimate PUC design here. So yeah, I think we've kind of recognized that there are sort of trade-offs in complexity and complication associated with either of these two options.
Do you, sorry, how does that change as other LRAs, as you've noted, isn't going to UCAP? I'm struggling a little bit on the idea of RAAIM and RAAIM reform when you have multiple LRAs choosing different accreditation values that ultimately gets, and how does that get to the CAISO to get to an appropriate must-offer obligation?
Yeah, you're asking questions, I think, at the heart of our questions to you all. So you turn it around well. I think that, like, to some degree, you could imagine it being, one option could be allowing LRA discretion to basically say, like, we're giving you one shown value, but we want to have a different performance benchmark, and having that flow into implementation. You could imagine a different mechanism where it's just sort of like, nope, we're going to take the single QC value and apply standardized processes that work across the LRAs. But there's different sort of, it's not the question you're getting is the heart of our issue, because there's not necessarily an easy answer of how it works from an implementation standpoint, and how it might work for different LRA programs. So partly, I think what we'd like to get is different feedback from different LRA and from different parties about how do we set this up in a manner that meets these competing objectives.
Thanks, Bertha. That's actually really helpful. I mean, is it a far stretch to say that the ISO would not consider separate RAAIM reform or separate RAAIM methodologies depending on how an LRA determines the accreditation?
I'll speak. Abdul's on the call here as a participant. I'd let him speak up as well. I do think that there's like you know, like the idea that we're going to have 20-something different RAAIM mechanisms that are tailored for different LRA designs probably isn't necessarily a feasible solution from an implementation standpoint. So I do think we are trying to, like, in the end, we're going to need something that sort of balances the objectives of the different LRA programs, but an implementation design that is, simple and structured enough to work within the CAISO's program.
And I think to that point, that's where the introduction of the performance benchmark megawatt value comes into play in terms of, is that a new value that provides that bridge between those different LRA programs? Or could it?
Yeah, I'm still trying to get wrap my head around this performance benchmark idea. Do you think having different planning reserve margins, or maybe ask this differently, how would having various different planning reserve margins change the RSE, for purposes of the ISO when it's trying to look at failure of passing the RSE test?
It doesn't change the RSE. The RSE is looking at bids, and RSE is really based on RA and non-RA megawatts that are essentially bid in and made available on behalf of the CAISO BAA. So it might change the portion that are coming from resource adequacy capacity, but we're not seeing a change or impact to the RSE or policy around EDM RSE or WEM RSE.
You don't think that having a PRM that doesn't meet a 0.1 or for the RA program would modify the benchmarking for RAAIM, as you have if you have resources RA resources that are on outage?
It might impact the number of, like, depending on the number of failures you had, it might impact how you view the appropriate cost allocation between load and resource. But ultimately, I think what I'm looking at is not altering what the EDM approved design looks like. And so it might sort of funnel into how is the ISO BA designing an incentive mechanism and doing allocation correctly. But I think what we're really alluding to is this is not really a change to the EDM design itself and what the allocation of cost looks like under EDM.
Okay, thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks, Noah.
Thanks, Noah. Now we have the last question in the queue from Eric Johnson. Go ahead, Eric.
Hi, this is Eric Johnson with the City of Pasadena. I just question on the slide where, this slide incorporates the NQC there, but on the other slides, we talk about just UCAP as an RA county. And it kind of preaches, it seems that you're looking at it as if UCAP is the way that everyone is going to go, when there are CPUC non-jurisdictional entities that are not using it. So it's kind of hard for me to wrap my head around looking at this and then trying to understand where you're going with it for when it incorporates a program that I haven't had any input on, that I don't know anything about, and that we're not planning to adopt.
And Eric, that is a great point, and I really want you, or maybe to kind of remind folks that this is really a discussion around to the extent that other LRAs develop this, but we're looking for our program to work for LRAs that do not have UCAP. And so for an LRA that isn't exploring UCAP, yes, we're exploring some changes to the must offer requirements, but from kind of that first and second column that's currently being shown on the screen, that wouldn't necessarily apply to a LRA that isn't exploring UCAP. We would still kind of have your shown value, the must offer, to the extent that we explore changes there. Maybe there are some changes. I think the question of, should there be an adjustment based on kind of what's operationally available still stands. But we are not looking to impose UCAP on LRAs that have not chosen that approach unless that LRA kind of is looking to use our default rules. Partha, anything to add?
No, I think you covered it. And that could be as simple as saying like this is probably the easy example. Your shown RA value is still based upon ICAP. The move is based upon the PMAX. And so it could be sort of saying it could be a far simpler design in terms of what ultimately works for you. But yeah, I don't think we're presupposing that.
And that's kind of where I'm going with it, is that instead of having all of these, it's your RA shown value. I don't need to know that it's UCAP. I don't care where you got it from. If that's where we're starting at, that's your RA shown value. And we don't need to adopt UCAP to do that.
I think that's correct. I think that the real question is probably for the PUC, for LRAs that do adopt UCAP, is like, is it as simple as we're going to use the shown value and that's what's going to be assessed performance based upon, or is there other considerations that we should factor in given their design? So, really, if the City of Pasadena is not going to adopt a UCAP method for resources, it might be a far simpler design, and it could be sort of saying like these other considerations are really for these other LRAs.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And I'm not seeing any other questions in the queue, so we can continue on.
And I'll just note for folks that when you look at the slides, you'll notice that we do have kind of some examples that I'm going to skip over. We've reviewed the policy, but those examples are really meant as a click down to kind of look at how policy would be applied from a settlement or cost allocation perspective with kind of a RAAIM reform option, looking at that performance benchmark megawatt value, or as well as kind of the EDAM RSC failure surcharge, just to kind of provide more context of what that would look like from implementation. So with remaining time, I did want to touch on our final topic, which is some proposed changes to our outage definitions. And so we can move to the next slide. And this has been a topic in our RA working group, and there has been kind of some questions around if or how we would be updating our outage definitions, and we've taken that feedback and provided some proposed changes for your feedback. Our goal here is really to align our outage classifications with the operational conditions that are happening to that unit and the timing of the submittal. And when we looked back at our definitions, there was sometimes inconsistent treatment of if it was focused on what was happening operationally or if it was focused on the timing of submittal. And so some of the key changes that you'll see include adding urgent outage as a new outage type. And our rationale for that is really to have a clear distinction between planned and forced outages. And what this means from an implementation perspective is that under the CAISO's default rules, urgent outages would receive a UCAP D rate and also be subject to RAAIM, as they're treated as forced at approval and do not require replacement capacity. We are looking to maintain off-peak opportunity outages as a subset of planned outages as an outage type. This really helps preserve flexibility for maintenance during low-risk hours and doesn't require substitute capacity. And then we are also looking to remove the short notice opportunity outages as an outage type. In some ways, it is redundant with urgent outages, but it has the added complication of a potential for misuse between planned and forced, and that leads to challenges in terms of, if it's RAAIM exempt or not, and challenges with the timing for the study window. So this is a summary of some of our key changes and the rationale for some of those proposed changes that we'd like your feedback on. And the next slide is really a summary and of all of those outage types next to each other. So if we can move to the next slide. And here we have the kind of updated definitions. And here's where we are suggesting that unsubstituted hours be subject to kind of the default UCAP and RAIM risk. But again, having these definitions both include the clarity around what is happening to the unit in the proposed definition and clarification around the timing for submittal is key to this. I see one question, and then we will move to next steps. So let's take our question from Noah.
Hey, this is Noah from Middle River Power again. So on the urgent and versus forced outage, I'm really actually not seeing any substantive differences. Is it a automatic distinction that will be within OMS to that will be assigned, for it to be called forced versus urgent?
It would have a different definition. You're raising an implementation question of how it would appear in OMS. We do anticipate having that differentiation, and those urgent outages would be prioritized akin to a forced outage in order to kind of have that priority in place.
But it's still, both are still within the less than 8-day window, correct?
Not necessarily. It is for an urgent outage, we are looking for that timing to be really as soon as you're aware that that urgent outage needs to occur.
Sorry, so if I am aware of my outage that needs to happen in 2 days, is that a forced outage or an urgent outage?
I can chime in, Anya, if you like.
Please go ahead, Abdul.
Oh, this is Abdul. No, this would be an urgent outage in that example. So if you have if the resource is tripping right now in real time, tripped already, and you're reporting it that, hey, my unit tripped, or is essentially about to trip right now, something happened and it needs to shut down, that's how the definition of forced outage would be. If there's heads up that you're aware of, heads up that, there's imminent need to do work on the resource, it cannot be done in the planned time horizon. You have to do the work urgently, really soon. That's when an urgent outage comes in. Today, both of these types are under forced outage. So today, the way we define a forced outage, both of these can apply a resource tripping or in imminent need of work that needs to take the unit out of service. And it has a 7-day limitation. So what we're doing is we're, per a lot of stakeholder feedback as well, detangling kind of the two by saying, if you know that there's imminent work coming up, and you might know more than 7 days in advance, so you can go ahead and submit it as an urgent outage, granted the criteria that this is urgent work, cannot wait for a planned time frame, and the unit is in imminent need or carries a risk of equipment failure. So that's the goal here, and that's how they would look like in the next phase.
Okay, and then so in here, in the future, are you proposing to completely eliminate all substitute capacity requirements for all forced and all non-planned outages? The complete ability.
There is no. Yeah, so today there is no requirement to submit substitution except for planned outages. So the substitution requirement is only for planned outages today. And I think that's the proposal, is to keep it that way, only required for planned outages. And off-peak opportunity are not required. Forced and urgent are not required either. Obviously, they are subject to today's RAAIM, tomorrow, potentially UCAP, MURA, whatever new structure could happen, those forced outages and urgent outages would make the resource unavailable for the purpose of those, performance assessments.
Asked another way, we currently have the capability of providing substitute capacity for forced outages in order to reduce RAIM. In the future, are you going to take that functionality away?
Correct. Yes. There's no. I think as we showed you guys the data in I think it was in the working group, you have the capability today, but you are not using it. That's what we are seeing. The fact that there's a new structure coming up with the UCAP, I think we think there's no need for a substitution opportunity in this case. It might have the negative effects without the positive effects that I think we were envisioned initially.
Well,
I don't know, Anya, is there anything you want to add there?
Could you repeat the question?
Oh, I was just saying if there's anything you want to add there, but I don't know. Noah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it answers the question. I would just say that I disagree with the premise that while substitution functionality is available during forced outage time frame, that it's there, that people are not using it, and therefore it's okay to eliminate it. I would say that there are market dynamics and lack of a liquid market in order to facilitate generators and SCs from doing so, along with a multitude of other ISO restrictions, such as local for local, like for like type of needs on the forced outage side, and therefore you have a lot of potentially substitution, forced outages that are not substituted. In addition to all the exempt outages or resources that do not require substitution, I think those are several different reasonings as to why you don't see as a robust substitution for forced outages. I think if you wanted to reduce forced outages, we should be looking at a better method of facilitating for the market to be more liquid. Thanks.
Thanks, Noah. And we do have our outage substitution kind of conversation separately. I am going to move us to next steps, and then we will take remaining questions after next steps. I see a couple of hands still, but for anyone that needs to leave on time with kind of noon time commitments, I wanted to turn things over to Ansel, who is our senior policy developer that will be drafting our straw proposal for RAIM reform options. And so with that, Ansel, please take us away. And could we also move to the next slide, Christina?
All right, thanks, Anya. Yeah, so I'm just going to go through this, and then we can go back to those hands. So like Anya mentioned, today's session was focused on concepts and helping us narrow the idea of what stakeholder-supported proposal might look like for this straw proposal. Obviously, we have issued a straw proposal in track 2 of the RA initiative focused on substitution last summer, but we haven't yet issued a proposal on the items we discussed today. So I think we're really looking to get comments on what we shared today. We have the date as March 16th right now, so please submit those comments through the commenting tool, which will open shortly. I think depending on what we hear from stakeholders, we are willing to kind of come back with further discussion kind of at the conceptual level. But if stakeholders feel like a straw proposal would be helpful to move us forward, then we'd also be interested in hearing that feedback. And I think we're continuing to move this forward as a combination of substitution reforms and RAIM reform, as well as the outage and must offer changes that we're discussing today. So still moving forward as a combined initiative. Partha?
Yeah, and maybe just to build off of that, like, to me, if as Ansel alluded to, if what would be most effective would be like, hey, let's come out with a strong proposal, give us something to, you know, give feedback on. Happy to do that based on feedback. If parties want to say, hey, no, we have an alternative design that we're willing to flesh out a little more, and we'd like to have the stakeholder group consider it, love to hear that as well in the comments, and particularly, like, you know, not expecting all the details, but fleshing out some ideas, and if you all want a venue, I think that might be a different pathway forward. That's probably what I'd add. Rich, maybe we could jump to Perry and Kathleen again. Does that sound like?
Yeah, that's great. Christina, could we unmute Perry?
Yes. Let's go to unmute Perry, please.
This is Perry Servideo, California Energy Storage Alliance. I think I'll touch on the next steps here first. We did have a discussion last week at the BPM change management meeting. There are currently 3 proposed revisions that discussion really led us towards a need to talk about those issues within the RA initiative space. And I think that it was thrown around that this would be the initiative to talk through those issues. And those are issues with the current RAIM and what it should be assessing and not assessing. So I was a little bit disappointed to see that there were no slides on this topic today. I think it's more concerning that I don't see the next step here of perhaps a meeting happening very shortly where we can talk about those PRRs within the RA context. Do you all have plans to have an additional meeting where we can talk through those 3 PRRs and the RA implications?
Well, I guess, Perry, though, you know, again, the BPMs, you know, really want to think of that as a separate topic to get into, but I think, you know, the policy issue going forward there would be the MOO. I mean, that's really what those are about, is what is the MOO and what does it represent? And so I think, you know, we talked a lot today about the MOO. I think those are more detailed questions than sort of the fundamental question of what is the MOO? Like, is it this quantity or that quantity? So I think that is something that would be covered as the MOO topic unfolds.
And maybe I could add to it. My understanding, and there's a lot of people on this call, so Perry, you can correct me. Some of those are flex questions as well, and what are the requirements associated with flex. And so to agree that that's the central issue, I would, your feedback is super helpful. I somewhat think of it as maybe tied into the long-term flex discussion more than maybe this incentive discussion. So that was probably another consideration I have. If you see it differently, Perry, I'd love to get your feedback.
All CEAS is looking for at this point is to move those discussions to the appropriate venue, as they are dissecting some clear RA policy issues. In our opinion, they're policy changes. And I think that there was a majority of stakeholders that commented on those that felt the same way, which means we should be discussing those with the RA policy folks in an RA policy initiative. And that's really been our only ask from the start of the PRR process for each of those 3 PRRs. And yeah, so, and it's solely focused on the existing RAIM policy, not the RAIM future policy. Additionally, on the call last week, at least for 1 or 2 of the PRRs, I believe Michael Martin said that an appropriate next step may be to put it on hold and have that discussion within the RA initiative space, at least while that PRR is on hold. So I was wondering if there's been that communication internally at CAISO, and if we can expect to see a meeting come up where we can talk through the RA policy issues associated with those PRRs.
Yeah, no, thank you, Perry. And I think if you want to include that in your comments, I think we obviously think of the policy discussion happening here and some of those BPM issues are largely separate topics, but really there's a policy overlap that you think should be scoped as a part of either this initiative and a future Flex initiative. Love to have your feedback in this venue as well. So
I think that Kaiso's point on the call was that the PRR would remain on hold until we can talk about it. So, you know, if you want to wait for us to clarify that by the 16th, which is, you know, 2 weeks from today, it just means that the PRR will be on hold longer, because then at that point you can take the comments and try to schedule a meeting, or we could move forward with scheduling a meeting to discuss the RA implications of those PRRs under the RA process. I'll just say our issue all along is that we haven't had the right people in the discussion. And it's the RA policy folks, you all, that I believe would be the right people to be talking about those issues with.
Yeah, I appreciate your feedback, Perry. And yeah, there's certainly discussions happening internally in terms of next steps. We think of these, again, as largely separate topics in terms of the compliance issues under the BPMs today, but really there's a policy overlap. We recognize that there are some things that at some point might require clarifications or policy enhancements. So to really you think there's something that needs to be adopted here, including the comments, would be super helpful. So,
yeah, we've already filed those comments within the PRR process. That's my point. And we were actually expecting this to be a topic for today. So that's why I'm asking if, you know, if not technically under RAMPed, some RA workshop that includes the RA policy folks they think is needed. And it's not about future, again, it's not about future RA policy. It's about the change to existing RA policy that those BPM changes are making and whether they are appropriate and within the existing policy or not.
No, thank you for that feedback.
Yep.
Thanks. Next, last question in the queue is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Go ahead, Kathleen.
Kathleen Colbert, Vistra. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Excellent. Okay. Just to be very brief, we will put in our written comments our feedback on the process as well, but I wanted to make a recommendation. You've talked about outage definitions. Perry has just raised another outage, let's say call it clarifications issue that's in play. And then we've also talked about the RAAIM reform. So just to be incredibly blunt, the outage definitions and those outage clarifications do seem similar in scope and would be beneficial for you to have another call to discuss, and would be beneficial for the outage definition for you to move to a straw proposal. So you've asked, would that be helpful? That would be helpful. Encourage you to do so. The RAAIM discussion is premature until we have at least a proposed decision from the CPUC on that framework, because it does clarify in there what is contracted. And one of the answers you gave to Tong implied a different contract than what is intended, at least as of today. What's being contemplated is the ICAP is contracted. So until we have that certainty, I actually think it's very harmful. This discussion has created some confusion, and implied elements are being considered at the commission that are not necessarily being considered. So for you to have a more productive way of working with the stakeholders, I would recommend you wait until the proposed decision makes it clear to you what that framework will be, and then you could do this conversation again with an actual guidance from the commission on what that framework is, rather than speculating. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. And I'm not seeing any other questions in the queue at this time. All right, well, thank you all for your feedback and participation on today's call. And Looking forward to reading everyone's comments. Thank you. Thank you. And I just have a couple quick announcements before we close the call. Here you can see some stakeholder meetings, comment deadlines occurring at the ISO this week. Here are some details on market simulation meetings and business practice manual updates. And lastly, for insights into the ISO grid and market operations, be on the lookout for our Energy Matters blog, or you can resubscribe. Here you can see some of our latest blog posts. So with that, we'd like to thank you so much for joining today's meeting. As a reminder, this meeting was recorded for informational and convenience purposes only, and all meeting materials are available on the initiative webpage, and the video recording will be posted there soon as well. We thank you very much, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.